To the extent that the cannabis industry has rock stars, Dr. Ethan Russo is one of them. His groundbreaking research on cannabis terpenes, the entourage effect, endocannabinoid deficiency, and phytocannabinoids in general are all essential reading for anyone looking to really understand the interaction between the cannabis plant and humans. I remember the first time I invited Dr. Russo to speak here on Vashon Island. We had 75 chairs set up like we normally would for a Vashon Island Marijuana Entrepreneurs Alliance meeting, and those chairs filled up really quickly. Then we used the rest of the chairs that were in the closet. And when we were out of chairs, folks sat on pillows and jackets on the floor in front of the chairs, and finally it was standing room only in the back. That night it was like an old school teach-in. Everybody was excited to have an opportunity to hear Dr. Russo speak in person and have their questions answered. See, for years, it has been nearly impossible for regular people to hear Dr. Russo speak because he worked at GW Pharmaceuticals and pretty much only spoke at high-priced exclusive pharmaceutical conventions. I remember very clearly the day I received an email from Ethan saying that he was no longer at GW and he was now free to accept my speaking invitation for a simple log cabin Grange Hall on Vashon Island. He sounded very excited because, Ethan really isn't an ivory tower kind of researcher. He's more interested in speaking directly to patients and working in the field like he had done previously in Morocco, China, and Peru. Dr. Russo's research paper titled Taming THC, Potential Cannabis Synergy and Phytocannabinoid Terpenoid Entourage Effects, has become a cornerstone of cannabis medicine. For many folks, myself included, it was the first time we had read a detailed paper explaining the interplay of different phytocannabinoids in a conversational tone that anyone could understand. You can find a link to the paper on our website. You are listening to the Shaping Fire podcast, and I am your host, Shango Los. On today's episode, we will go point by point through the entire text of Dr. Russo's Taming THC paper and enjoy some rare commentary from Dr. Russo himself. If you would like to hear more candid interviews with the cannabis industry's top professionals, subscribe to the Shaping Fire newsletter to receive new episode announcements. We find that relying on social media to connect with you continues to get less and less reliable, so I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter at shapingfire.com. Dr. Ethan Russo is a board-certified neurologist and former senior medical advisor to GW Pharmaceuticals. He served as study physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for 3 Phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Massachusetts Medical School before residencies in pediatrics in Phoenix, Arizona, and in child and adult neurology at the University of Washington in Seattle. He was a clinical neurologist in Missoula, Montana for 20 years in a practice with a strong chronic pain component. In 1995, he pursued a 3-month sabbatical doing ethnobotanical research with indigenous people in Peru. He joined GW as a full-time consultant in 2003. He has held faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana, in medicine at the University of Washington, and as visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He has been president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and is former chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines. He is author of several books on cannabis medicine and has published over 30 articles in neurology, pain management, cannabis, and ethnobotany. Welcome to the show, Ethan.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really glad that you were willing to make the time to join us. So let's start with something pretty basic. So we know that phytocannabinoids exist, and there must be a reason that they exist in nature. So, what natural benefit do phytocannabinoids offer to the plant that makes them exist in the first place?
Well, straight out of the chute, it's important to relate that they're not there for human enjoyment. The plant itself is much older than humans are as a species. So yes, you're right. They perform an ecological role in the plant, and actually it's more than one. One of the things is that the cannabinoids protect the plant from genetic damage from ultraviolet light exposure. One of the things we know is that production of the cannabinoids will be increased with higher light pressure and at a higher elevation. So those two things go together. Another interesting role of the cannabinoids is that some of them are insecticidal. So if a bug lands on the flower, there are 2 ways in which the bug can meet its demise. One is from chemical attack by the cannabinoids, and the other is just the stickiness of the trichomes will trap them. Finally, The cannabinoids also are helpful in pruning the plant. As it's trying to mature and become fertilized, these will rain down on the fan leaves, and they will tend to die. So what the plant is doing near the end of its year of growth is putting all the effort, chemically speaking, into getting fertilized and nurturing that flower in the hopes that it will become fertilized. But that's usually thwarted by humans that want it to remain unfertilized to get the greater cannabinoid production.
That's interesting to me, hearing you describe it almost as a defense mechanism and as a plant regulator, because, in our own endocannabinoid system, that's the same thing that phytocannabinoids do for us, a defense and regulation of our systems. There must be some similarity at a nature level where these chemicals are helping living things.
Well, that's exactly right. There's a increasing appreciation now that these plant defense compounds also extend towards effects on humans too. There's a very interesting book by Kennedy called Plants and the Human Brain that goes into these relationships in greater depth, but that's it. Some of these antioxidants that the plant produces to prevent diseases have the same kind of protective functions in humans, and this is the reason that a highly varied plant diet seems to help prevent aging, help prevent cancer, and things of this sort.
Right on. That's really interesting. So today, instead of talking necessarily about defending the plant, we're going to be talking about these different phytocannabinoids effects on our humans. And there's a bunch of terms that could be unfamiliar to folks that we're going to run into today. But one of them that I ran into from rereading the paper now, because I haven't read it in a couple years. But before we get into the meat of the topic, I'd really appreciate it if you would explain the difference for folks, the difference between an agonist and an antagonist, because I feel we'll probably be using that quite a bit.
Right. Well, we have receptors on our cells. Probably the place that's most familiar to people would be in neurotransmission. In other words, how nerve cells communicate one to another. And it is a combination of chemical and electrical transmission. But receptors on cells are things that help affect a certain kind of reaction. So we can think of it as a lock and key model. In fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. But an agonist will be like a key that fits in the lock and produces a stimulation of a certain function. An antagonist goes in the opposite direction. It lowers the function. And then we've got modifiers beyond that. There are things called inverse agonists, which, despite the way it sounds, actually lower the overall activity. So they're like a super antagonist. But we'll explain these in context as they come up.
Right on. So to really simplify it, an agonist is more likely to increase the effect, and an antagonist is more likely to decrease the effect.
That's quite right.
Great. Another aspect that you mentioned in the paper a few times that I'd love to hear broken out before we get into it is Raphael Mechoulam's law of stinginess, which I love the name, but I had not heard that referred to before. So if you'd kind of explain that example before we get into it.
Sure. What he means is enzymes, which are catalysts that help bring reaction onward, may act on more than one substrate. A substrate is a chemical that is turning into another chemical. So, for example, there are two basic kinds of cannabinoids: the propyl with a 5-carbon side chain. Propyl with a 3-carbon side chain, and the pentyl with a 5-carbon side chain. But certain enzymes can work on both. There are other enzymes that aren't following the law of stinginess that may only work on one compound. So,
right on. So we're going to jump into the first wave of cannabinoids. And as I was telling folks in the introduction, we're kind of going to go through them as a list, the way that you do in the paper, in a couple of groups. The first one being the THC, CBD, and the ones that we're more familiar with. And then we'll move on to the terpenes, and then we'll talk about their applications. So I know that we could do an entire show just on THC, but it is the first cannabinoid that you go ahead and explain. So let's start there with the big elephant in the room. So if you would, kind of review THC and how it relates to phytocannabinoid activity.
Sure. Well, THC is probably the single chemical most associated with cannabis, and it is the primary psychoactive ingredient. In other words, the compound that makes people high. But it has a lot of very important medical effects. As an analgesic, meaning a painkiller. It's an antispasmodic. It prevents spasms. It lowers muscle tone. It is a muscle relaxant. That's the basis for its use in treating spasticity, muscle tone tightness that occurs in multiple sclerosis and a variety of other brain diseases. And that benefit has made Sativex, which does contain THC, an approved drug in 27 countries, just not here in the U.S.
When I'm talking to patients, one of the examples that I give for how THC actually decreases pain is I said, there's kind of there's two paths to it. The first path is it's anti-inflammatory, muscle relaxation, and general analgesic effect. But then also what I've gotten to started calling cascading forgetfulness, right? Because we talk with cannabis folks, and you get a little high, and then you forget where you put your keys, and you go on doing other things, and that kind of idea of short-term forgetting often has patients forget that they're in pain. It's also, I think, why it works so well with PTSD folks, because you just get distracted by life and you get involved and you forget that you're in pain. So I like to think about it having these two different paths. Do you think that's a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, it sure is, because you've hit on two of the key mechanisms. One is a direct effect against pain that works through complex pathways in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves out in the body. So that's one. But the other is the way it modulates the emotional part of pain. And so, part of it is distraction, but additionally, there have been studies that show that the emotional factor in pain is considerably reduced by cannabinoids and specifically by THC. So that combination together is quite powerful and doing something that other drugs just don't do.
I can't be the only one listening to you talk right now, feeling a little giddy to be able to get information directly from the source. So many of us who are trying to learn about cannabis, we're getting our information from secondary sources, right? And secondary sources are not really as good as hearing it right from you. So anyway, it's a real joy to actually hear it in your own words. So one more thing on THC before we move on. I'd love for you to review a little bit. THC, in isolate is not the magical thing, right? We understand the entourage effect, and I talked a little bit about that in the introduction. But would you talk about the importance of not using THC on its own, and that it needs the other phytocannabinoids to be there with it?
Right. Well, the easiest thing would be an illustration. THC as a single compound, a synthetic form, was approved in the United States in 1985, and that was to treat nausea associated with chemotherapy. But many people tolerated it poorly. Almost no one liked it the way that they might like cannabis. And people who'd used both said, this really isn't like cannabis. Cannabis works a lot better. That wasn't something that everyone was prepared to hear. Certainly the government had an investment in the idea that, well, we've given you access to THC, you don't need cannabis for medicinal purposes anymore. I can tell you that in my neurology practice, after Marinol, synthetic THC, was downscheduled in 1999, I used it pretty extensively for the next 4 years in a variety of contexts, and it's a very tricky drug. It's quite different to cannabis in that it's likely to produce dysphoria. So that's unhappiness as opposed to euphoria. It's very distracting. It's very difficult to control. There's a very fine line between a dose that might help symptoms like reducing pain and that which produces unwanted side effects like distraction or anxiety. So in other words, THC alone has what we call a very narrow therapeutic index. Now, in contrast, when there are other ingredients aboard, particularly cannabidiol or certain of the terpenoids, you get a great expansion of that therapeutic index so that much more THC can be used to better effect and without so many adverse events or side effects.
Right on, good. So before we move on to CBD, let's talk briefly about THCA, which is the naturally occurring acid form of THC. Now, I think most of us know that to convert the naturally forming THCA into THC, we need to add some heat to decarboxylate it. But a lot of people are looking at THCA for different therapeutic effects than THC. What are the different therapeutic effects between the two?
Right. Well, they're quite distinct in their activities. THCA is considered non-psychoactive. In other words, it doesn't produce the high that we associate with THC. Additionally, THCA is also an anti-inflammatory, but through a different mechanism. It affects a molecule called tumor necrosis factor alpha that is important in certain autoimmune diseases such as Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and rheumatoid arthritis. Additionally, and this one needs a lot more work, there seems to be benefit in epilepsy. THC can be helpful in epilepsy too, but there seems to be a distinct mechanism that really hasn't been adequately explored yet. So despite raw cannabis having been used medicinally for a long time throughout history, it just hasn't received the research that THC itself has. So it's a place where we need to learn a lot more. I'll mention one other thing that it can do. It seems to be very powerful against certain tumors, particularly skin tumors. And so, again, this is an area that really deserves more research attention.
So I know that we could probably do an entire show just devoted to CBD as well as we could with THC. But let's go ahead and review cannabidiol and talk about how it is so helpful to the human body.
Yeah, well, there's this dichotomy that's developed. A lot of people tend to think of cannabidiol as the good cannabinoid, where THC is the bad cannabinoid, and I really reject that. Both have their place. Actually, for most kinds of problems, a combination, in other words, using a type of cannabis that contains both is usually a distinct advantage. But it's really fascinating because cannabidiol, being a different molecule just by a little bit, has quite distinct features. Some of its activities are similar to THC in that both are anti-inflammatory, both are analgesic painkillers, but as compared to THC, cannabidiol actually reduces anxiety. It's an antipsychotic. In other words, it's been used in schizophrenia to treat that disorder primarily, and a whole list of other properties beyond that.
Yeah, while we're on that, let's go ahead and plug the great website at projectcbd.org. They've got a great page on their website. You can click on the word conditions on the website, and it lists a whole bunch of different human ailments that you might have. And you can click on any condition, and they will pull up for you the scientific studies that are showing that the different cannabinoids, the effect it can have, whether you have Parkinson's or pain or asthma or anything. So that's projectcbd.org. So Ethan, a lot of us have heard of THC and CBD, but there's all these other cannabinoids. Is CBD so popular because it is so unique from the other cannabinoids, or is it because it's the first one to get extensive research?
Well, a combination of the two, but really, if you ask me, in my experience as a physician and researcher, the single most versatile medicine that I've ever encountered, it would be cannabidiol. There are at least 30 distinct activities that it has. So it is what's often derisively termed a dirty drug. However, dirty drug may also be one that works. And the remarkable thing about CBD is at the same time, if you asked me the safest drug, the one with the fewest side effects that I've ever encountered, it would also be cannabidiol. Because there are very few of the things that it does, even at very high doses, that are deleterious to the human body. So it's really a remarkable product. And perhaps its greatest attribute is that it's able to modulate the endocannabinoid system. Now, I know that you've discussed the endocannabinoid system with your audience before, but just to mention again, it's a great homeostatic regulator. In other words, it brings various physiological systems in the body back into balance. And since cannabidiol is a general stimulant to endocannabinoid tone, it has the capability of improving function in a variety of areas of physiology that might be deranged. So if there's pain, it helps with that. If there's too much activity in the gut, it will reduce it. If there's too little, it will increase it. So it has a sort of buffering effect to bring physiology back into balance.
That's great. I think that in Chinese medicine, they call that a tonifier. It brings you back to the neutral, to the center.
Well, that's exactly a great analogy there, sure.
Right on. So we're going to take a short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest this week is Dr. Ethan Russo. Now that the health benefits of terpenes have become well known in the cannabis industry, people everywhere are looking for the purest terpenes without adulterants. The problem with most terpene providers is that they're not sourced naturally and instead are made as a byproduct of refining petroleum, and that's so sketchy. The terpenes sold by True Terpenes are entirely different. They are certified organic, non-GMO, and food grade. That means that they are extracted from real plant sources. There are no solvents of any kind. They are distilled only with steam. That's right, only steam. In fact, terpenes from True Terpenes are so pure that you can eat them. Not only that, but you can stack them with better results too. And what I mean is, other companies' terpenes have got a few % of impurities, and when you stack those terpenes to make your blend, you're adding a variety of impurities that degrade your final product. True Terpenes also have strain-specific terpenes for a wide range of cannabis strains like Durban Poison, Sunset Sherbet, and Granddaddy Purple. True Terpenes has robust and supportive customer service, so your questions will get answered fast and efficiently. If you shop for terps before, you know how rare that is. So whether you want to cup your hands to smell some Beta-Caryophyllene to calm down after getting too high, or if you want to dab some pinene so your lungs feel fabulous and your mind feels liberated, True Terpenes will provide you with a truly natural experience. If you are a cannabis product developer, these are the terps you want to add to your oil or edible or capsule or whatever. True Terpenes are simply the best your money can buy. Don't try and make a premium product with substandard terps. Choose True Terpenes for a top-shelf experience. Go to shapingfire.com/True Terpenes to find out more, or click on the link in this week's newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest this week is world-renowned cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. So before the break, we hit the two biggies, THC and CBD. And so we're going to continue down the list of the other phytocannabinoids that are mentioned in your famous Taming THC paper. And we're going to start with one of the very rarely talked about ones, CBC. What can you tell us about CBC?
Well, this is one that needs a lot more work and a lot more attention. Part of the problem is that cannabichromene is formed by a recessive gene, in contrast to THC and CBD, where the pathways are from dominant genes. So it's a bit of a rarer bird in most commercially available forms of cannabis. Additionally, it has a feature of being a little more prominent in immature plants. So if people wait until maturity, there's going to be less CBC. But one of my colleagues from GW Pharmaceuticals, David Potter, used young plants to make what he called an enriched trichome product, which is another way of saying hash. He made this with young plants that did show a predilection towards making more cannabichromene, CBC, and was able to get a good concentration that way. Unfortunately, it's never been used in a clinical trial yet, despite having great promise on its own.
When you say it appears most in young plants, you're meaning young plants that are early in the bloom, right? So that they're forming trichomes as part of the blooming cycle? Or do you mean young as in they're still in veg?
Well, it'd be during the flowering phase. As with the other cannabinoids, greatest production is going to be in the capitate glandular trichomes that appear in the unfertilized female flowers. It would just be earlier in the flowering cycle, as you mentioned.
Right on. I just wanted to make a difference between that and something like cannaflavin, right, which is actually in a young plant, but also early in the veg stage, if I understand it correctly.
Sure, even in the sprouts.
Right on. Fantastic. So sounds like we definitely need more research into CBC, and since it's a less common one, aggressive breeders could start focusing on hybridizing for more CBC.
Sure, there'd be an advantage because as CBD is an endocannabinoid modulator, so too is CBC. CBC is also anti-inflammatory. It's very active against a variety of cancer cell lines, so it shows a lot of promise.
Great. So I've heard of CBG a little more often, and there are many labs that are able to start testing for it. Why do we care about CBG?
Well, it's sort of the parent molecule to the other phytocannabinoids, so that alone makes it important. Normally in the plant, it doesn't stop there. It goes onward to either THC, CBD, or CBC, or the propyl cannabinoids. But again, there have been plants bred in England that quit at CBG. They don't have the enzymatic equipment due to a mutation to go beyond it. And so in those plants, 100% of the cannabinoids would be as cannabigerol. So cannabigerol, again, is one I'm excited about for the future because, again, this hasn't been used in human clinical trials, but it has very interesting properties. It seems to be a very strong anti-anxiety agent without being sedating. Most of the drugs that are used that way in humans, like the benzodiazepines, Valium, etc., are not only sedating but addictive, and this is quite different to what we see with CBG. There's no indication that it would be addictive at all. Additionally, it has some muscle relaxant properties. It interestingly, is a strong antibiotic or disinfectant. One of the things it does is it works against MRSA, that's multiply resistant Staphylococcus aureus, one of those hospital-acquired infections that was rampant throughout the U.S. a few years ago, and poses a real risk for hospitalized patients that might be quite ill.
So if CBG is kind of a parent cannabinoid, does that mean that when it degrades with time or light that it could degrade into a different cannabinoid?
No, not unless the plant is alive to provide the enzymes to do it. Usually in the plant machinery of cannabinoid production, it just doesn't stop there. It goes on through to the next item. And so usually CBG doesn't accumulate in great amounts in a given plant.
Right on. Earlier in 2016, THCV was all through the media because people started talking about its appetite suppression attributes, and supposedly some of the forms of Blue Dream are heavy in it, and people love the idea that you could use cannabis but also not get the munchies. How effective is THCV to actually suppress the appetite? Does it do it a little bit, or does it really not give you the munchies?
Well, in pure form, which would not be accessible to people, it's quite prominent in its appetite suppression effects, without a speedy effect that one would get, say, from an amphetamine. So this is quite distinct. The trouble is, in cannabis that's available in commerce in North America, usually the amount of tetrahydrocannabivarin, or THCV, is quite low. But again, in England, there is a plant where over 90% of the cannabinoids are expressed as THCV. So that one has been used in humans, and it has the added benefit of being a pretty good anticonvulsant, drug for seizures. It's beyond the appetite suppressant part. It seems to be helpful in the metabolic syndrome. So this would be the problems that people get into if they're diabetic or pre-diabetic.
So, what you just said there was pretty heavy duty. The fact that the commercially available cannabis strains that have THCV don't really have enough in it to truly suppress the appetite. So taking that to the extreme end and talking about the example that you gave from the UK where it's 90%, is, if you ingested that strain, would it actually suppress the appetite, or does it just make a really good target for extraction to extract THCV out of it to then apply that to the patient?
No, that particular plant, when it's extracted, even with a little bit of THC in it, does have the benefits that I mentioned. The point is, though, that at least in the U.S., we're not there yet in terms of optimizing THCV chemovars. The available ones may produce less of the munchies, but they're not going to have all of the attributes that we mentioned that have been seen with the extracts that have been used in clinical trials so far.
Right on. So in your paper, Taming THC, after THCV, you moved to CBDV.
Right. Well, this one also has just started in human use. So this is the corresponding agent to CBD. So as THC is to THCV, CBDV is as to CBD. This looks like CBD, but it's got a 3-carbon side chain instead of 5. And it's being investigated for seizures of partial onset, what used to be called focal seizures. There seems to be a good signal there. I really couldn't say a lot more about how it affects people yet, except that it appears to be non-intoxicating and appears to be quite safe in the experiments that have been done so far.
in the last year, we've seen a lot of new products coming out that are supplemented with CBN, and most of them are people are saying, well, CBN totally helps you sleep, and so they'll take their product, an edible or something, and they'll add CBN to it. Do you think that CBN will have that kind of effect when supplemented into edibles?
I'm not a proponent of spiking things in that manner. My personal bias is that with time and attention and proper selective breeding, you can get the effects you want from a given cannabis cultivar without needing to add anything to it. Additionally, there's some misconceptions about cannabinol or CBN. As a pure compound, it really is not very sedating. It is THC-like, but about a quarter of the potency. The confusion may arise because CBN is a non-enzymatic breakdown product of THC. In other words, in old cannabis, it will oxidize from THC into CBN. At the same time, you get a loss of the monoterpenoids, and you get remaining some of the higher molecular weight sesquiterpenoids that tend to be sedating. And so old cannabis tends to be soporific. That's a medicalese for saying that it makes you sleep. But the CBN itself is not strongly sedating.
I was going to save this for the next section when we talk about terpenoids, but let's talk about it right now. Would you explain the difference between monoterpenoids and sesquiterpenoids?
Sure. Terpenoids are built up of 5 carbon blocks. The so-called monoterpenoids have 10 carbons. The sesquiterpenoids have 15. The diterpenoids have 20, and the triterpenoids have 30 carbons. So that's it. And terpene means there's confusion about these terms, but a terpenoid is a broader term and would include agents that have oxygen in them or occasionally other molecules. A terpene, strictly speaking, has just carbon and hydrogen.
Right on. So one more thing on CBN before we move on to the group of terpenoids. It's common said amongst cannabis folk that say, for example, I've got this flower left over from last summer's grow. It's all CBN now. If you smoke it, you'll just get couch lock and fall asleep. And while that's the kind of a rule of thumb, you mentioning that CBN is not really all that sedative. Is there truth to the rule of thumb that I just explained, or is that more myth?
Well, the phenomenology, in other words, the description you gave is probably accurate. A lot of older cannabis is going to be sedating. It won't be stimulating necessarily. A lot of people find it less attractive. But again, it would be from the sedative influences of the remaining terpenoids.
Right on. So most of us know that terpenoids are the smell of the plant now, the aromatherapy, if you will. Would you explain what exactly a terpenoid is and why the plant bothers to produce them?
Sure. Well, these are produced in the glandular trichomes along with the cannabinoids. And again, these are molecules that the plant makes often in its defense. Some of these are insect repellents or insecticides. Others actually attract certain desirable bugs. And they're often antioxidants and antibiotics. But again, we can leverage what the plant has done to help our own ailments.
I know that when I'm shopping for cannabis, I usually shop with my nose. I mean, obviously, I like bag appeal as much as anybody does, but really, we're opening jars, we're sticking our nose in there, and when our body has this reaction of, yeah, I want more of this. We go ahead and choose that strain. Is there any support or truth to the fact that our body, when smelling specific terpenoids, knows what it needs, and so our body is self-selecting for the medicine that's best for us then?
May well be. It's a hard thing to measure. I can say this. The situation that you describe is quite accurate. Michelle Sexton, naturopath who's investigated this, looked at patient preferences in Washington State, and the number one criterion for selection of a particular cannabis chemovar was its smell.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And what's interesting too is how strains that have got wildly different smells I can be attracted to both. I can smell something that's really foul and skunky and smells like a baby diaper, like perhaps like a funky cheese, and I'm like, oh, I really need some of that. And then I'll smell some lemon diesel with a really bright citrus smell, and I'm like, oh, I want that too. It's interesting how we can be our human can be attracted to a variety of terpenes that are very much unlike each other.
Well, as they say, variety is the spice of life.
So, are terpenoids from cannabis and food and other sources the same? Do they have the same effect regardless of where they're from when they're in isolate?
Yeah, in general, yes. There are no terpenoids that we know of that appear only in cannabis. There's certain profiles that are characteristic, but these are part of everyday life. If you're eating citrus, you're exposed. If you take a walk in a forest, you're exposed to pinene. If you have a plant-based diet, you're exposed to these. But the key thing is how they synergize with THC and other cannabinoids. And this is the real difference. So if the question were, will exposure to terpenoids from food exert benefits? Yes, I believe that they do. It's just that in terms of the experience one has with cannabis, they're really fundamental to the differences that one experiences one chemovar to another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one more question before we go to our next commercial. One of the things that really caught me off guard reading in your paper, you say that, the terpenoids increase with intensity of light, but decrease with soil fertility. And that really caught me off guard because most of the growers I know are trying to make a very fertile living soil to help the terps develop. Why is it true that decreased soil fertility will increase terpenoids?
Sure. Well, first off, the rich soil at the beginning is great, but depletion of the soil towards the end seems to help the terpenoids. And this shouldn't be a big surprise if we consider that our herbs or lavender grow best in a sandy soil where environmental conditions are a little rough. Keep in mind that the terpenoids are plant defense compounds, and so if the environment is a little more difficult, your terpenoid production is going to increase. For people growing cannabis, having a little less water and a lot less nutrients towards the end of the flowering cycle are going to produce the same kind of effect.
It's specifically, now that we've got all the growers' attention, when would you decrease the nutrients and water to get that effect? How many weeks in?
Oh, I can't tell you that exactly. I'm sure there are people who know, but I'm not sure off the top.
Right on, that's fair enough. So we're going to take another short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest this week is Dr. Ethan Russo.
For anyone who is paying attention to cannabis medicine, it has become incredibly apparent that full extract cannabis oil, known to some as Rick Simpson oil, is the cornerstone of healing humans with medical marijuana. If you own a medical dispensary or a retail store, you know that your customers are asking for it every single day. And if you have been working with patients and seeking out quality full extract oil in the Pacific Northwest, you know the provider, Deep Green. Kat Jeter and her team at Deep Green have been making full extract cannabis oil and setting the standards for quality and exact dosing for years in Washington state. The Deep Green brand is known by patients and cannabis media as a premium quality provider for sick children, cancer patients, and others in need. At a time when there are no national standards for cannabis oil, ensuring a product is whole plant, quality assured, and lab tested is often a matter of knowing your source is reputable. Trust in a quality brand is essential when choosing a cannabis medicine that is going to be used concentrated and in volume by any patient, and especially those with weakened immune systems. Deep Green is looking for national brand partners to expand the availability of their legacy top-shelf cannabis oil to emerging medical and licensed states. Partners benefit from the Deep Green brand recognition and credibility, as well as ongoing customer and marketing support. Not only that, but Deep Green knows how to employ the 280E tax rule so you can deduct it all from your taxes. Working with Deep Green can provide the trust and authenticity too often pushed aside in favor of lifestyle products. Your customers can assure themselves that regardless of the state in which it is made, brand licensees adhere to the same strict standards that patients everywhere have come to expect from Deep Green. Deep Green licensing includes startup and capital planning, as well as operational and manufacturing instruction, as you'd expect. For more information on how your company, co-op, or medical dispensary can benefit from partnering with Deep Green to provide full extract cannabis oil to patients, go to shapingfire.com/Deep Green to connect with Kat Jeter and her team. That's shapingfire.com/Deep Green.
Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest this week is world-renowned cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. So before the break, we kind of set up the terpenoids and talked about what they are as a group and kind of what their attributes are. So for this section, we're going to go through the very specific terpenoids that you talk about in your groundbreaking paper, Taming THC. So let's start with D-limonene.
Yes, my favorite.
I guess it's good to have a favorite, I guess.
Yeah, limonene is a really fascinating compound, and it's pretty ubiquitous. Unfortunately, the place you're most likely to run into it is walking down the detergent aisle at the supermarket. To our senses, the scent of lemon or citrus denotes cleanliness or healthiness. So there's a reason it's there that way. It not only makes an efficient cleaning agent, but it has this strong psychological effect, one of brightness, cleanliness, and improved mood. And that's exactly what limonene will produce when it's there in a significant amount along with the cannabinoids.
I tell people who are unfamiliar with terpenes that if they want to have the experience of limonene, to just simply cut a piece of citrus fruit like a lemon, and you smell it, and suddenly you feel motivated and happy and full of sunshine and joy, and that is the terpenes having a direct effect on you. When you cut a lemon, is that limonene, and then when you cut an orange, that's citrine?
No, they're both primarily limonene. The difference between the various citrus fruits, almost all of them have very high percentage of limonene in the rind. If you take your thumbnail across the rind of a citrus, you're releasing trichomes and limonene. The differences in the smells and taste come from much lower concentration factors, other terpenoids that are distinct from one another in the various kinds of citrus.
That certainly kind of explains why so many cocktails are served with a twist, right? Because
right.
As you're bringing the cocktail up to your nose, you're getting this hit of limonene that's making you feel joyous as you're enjoying the cocktail, and no wonder we like it.
Sure.
So the next one that you cover in the paper is beta-myrcene.
Right. Myrcene is the most prevalent terpenoid in most available chemovars of cannabis. To me, that's unfortunate. Certainly, there are people that prefer it, but it has a strongly sedating, narcotic-like effect. And so, if there's a kind of cannabis that makes people unable to move, what's commonly termed couch lock, it's likely that it's due to a high myrcene content. So that's not always an advantage. If someone needs to sleep or needs to relax, certainly it can be. On the plus side, myrcene does have analgesic, pain-killing properties and a variety of other properties that can be beneficial. But in general, there's a lot of it out there and maybe more than is needed for optimal effect. Certainly for people who have to work or study, it's usually not an advantage to have a high concentration of myrcene.
So it would be remiss if we didn't touch on mangoes here for a moment, because a lot of people say that, if you want to enjoy your cannabis especially well, go ahead and eat a mango before it, because the myrcene improves the experience of the cannabis. How much of that is myth and how much of that is real?
Mostly myth. Mm-hmm. There's actually a paper that was done on the terpenoid content of mangoes, and it varies from being a fair amount to some where there's almost none. Additionally, a lot of people will say that myrcene helps to get THC across the blood-brain barrier. Well, normally THC has no problem getting across the blood-brain barrier. Both of these compounds are what we call lipophilic, fat-loving, and they all go right into the brain without any difficulty. So I think mangoes are really healthy, and people should eat them because they want to or enjoy it. But I think the likelihood that that's going to have a material effect on their experience is pretty low.
Right on. Well said. Well, let's talk about one of my favorites, Alpha-Pinene. One of the first times that I heard you speak, it really impressed me that, I love walking in the forest. I love that Nordic term to take maybe it's a Japanese term. Anyway, to take a forest bath.
Yes,
go out.
exactly.
Yeah, I love that idea. And you were explaining how, when you go into the forest and you're around these pine trees and they're giving off pinene, and you take a big breath and you fill your lung sacs and you're like, the forest. And actually what you're getting is a big hit of pinene, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, is just the act of walking in a forest in Japan. A lot of people, if they've had a difficult work day, they want to clear their head, that's exactly what they'll do, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, is take a walk in pine forest, or in our instance, it's going to be other conifers, but they're all rich in pinene, so the effect on one's mood is going to be the same. But it goes further than that. Unfortunately, pinene is less common in modern chemovars of cannabis. It's sort of been shoved aside by myrcene, if you will. But in chemovars that have it, the end result is an experience that's much clearer without the confusion and the short-term memory that people often equate with THC. Clearly, THC does produce impairment of short-term memory, but pinene is what's called a cholinesterase inhibitor. It inhibits the breakdown of acetylcholine, which is the main memory molecule in the brain. So it reverses this effect that THC has, and particularly for a patient who needs cannabis, having pinene in the chemovar that they're using is much more likely, if they use it, it'd be much more likely that they'll be able to work or study without the impairment that can come in if there's too much THC or if there's too much sedation from myrcene, for example.
I see. So something with a lot of pinene would be really good for daytime because you can be more productive and a little more focused and have more likelihood to stay on task.
Right. And again, I'd emphasize that a lot of this is subject to people's preferences. There's some people that love the Myrcene couch lock effect, and others really dislike it. So taste comes into this in a big way.
Yeah, I'm actually one of those people that loves Myrcene. I can enjoy the most couch lockiest strains and still have a good time of it because I tend to run really hot and fast anyway. I generally stay away from sativas just because they tend to overamp me. And that's one of the important parts of individualized medicine, right? Where not one size does not fit all. And when people are originally getting into cannabis, they should take some time to sample a wide variety of strains so that they can taste a lot of these different terpenoids and find out the one that their human enjoys the most.
Sure. And again, I'd extend that to therapeutic applications, the one that's going to give them the best benefits on their symptoms and produce the fewest side effects.
Am I correct that linalool, the next terpenoid we're going to talk about, is pretty heavy in lavender and is one of the aspects that makes us feel so calm when we smell it or use a lavender eye pillow?
Yeah, that's exactly right. A pretty remarkable compound. In addition to having those anti-anxiety effects, can aid sleep. It's a very strong local anesthetic. One of the things I always like to talk about is that people should keep a bottle of lavender essential oil in the fridge in the kitchen, because if you get a kitchen burn and put the lavender oil on neat and cover it with an ice cube, the pain will generally go away in a few minutes and almost never blister.
Is it too intense straight? Would you need to thin it out with something? You know how some essential oils will burn the skin?
Right. No, it's a good point, but lavender oil is safe to use neat, undiluted on the skin. Right
on. So our next one, Beta-Caryophyllene, I had a really cool experience with. A couple weeks ago, I was down in Sonoma County for Emerald Cup, and I was staying at a house with a whole bunch of cannabis business owners. We kind of just split this wine country villa. It was pretty great. And I met Ben Cassidy from True Terpenes, and he was going around the house and giving people some Beta-Caryophyllene in their hands, and then he was encouraging us to cup our hands to our face. And it had a faint smell of black pepper, but the thing that was remarkable was how incredibly calming it was. And I had never really considered dosing myself with terpenes in such a simple and elegant way as to just put a little bit in my palm and then cup it to my nose.
Sure. Well, it's a direct pathway to the brain. It's interesting. This is something we need to explore more because generally caryophyllene is considered, quote, non-psychoactive, unquote, but certainly it has powerful anti-inflammatory effects. And in a situation where someone had inflammation for any reason, particularly in the brain, it's very likely going to be therapeutic. And that could manifest itself in change of mood, certainly. But it's really remarkable because caryophyllene, which is a sesquiterpenoid, in other words, 15-carbon molecule, is not just a terpenoid, it's a cannabinoid too. It is a strong agonist, stimulator at the CB2 receptor. That is the cannabinoid receptor that's non-psychoactive and is important out in the body and potentially in the brain for pain and inflammation. So this is a fascinating agent, and it's common in our diets. You mentioned black pepper. That's the most accessible source, but there are other good examples like copaiba balsam, which has been used in South America to treat inflammation, sprains, and skin conditions for generations by indigenous people long before we knew anything about the chemicals in it, which is primarily caryophyllene.
I kind of think that we need an expanded vocabulary because that idea of being psychoactive or not, a lot of people are talking about THC being psychoactive and CBD being non-psychoactive and then beta-caryophyllene not being psychoactive. But I know that when I smelled it in my palms, it clearly had a calming effect, which tells me that it is active psychologically, right? And so for me, it was psychoactive, but it did not have that getting high or stoning effect that THC does. It feels to me like over time we need to develop and widen our vocabulary for these experiences.
I'd endorse that approach.
Do you know anybody who's, is there a paper written about that or anything that you'd recommend that I and others read about that delineation, or has that work not really taken place yet?
Probably more the latter. There are some extensive reviews on caryophyllene, really looking at the effects that it has on the brain or on mood have just begun. Unfortunately, a lot of the real emphasis isn't on caryophyllene, but trying to make synthetic drugs that would be like it, that might be more marketable from an intellectual property standpoint. I think that such effort is misguided when we have a readily available natural agent that's not only effective but quite safe.
There's this great term that we got from Dr. Dominic Corva of CASP when he was on the show a couple months ago. He talks about whole plant politics. People like myself in this show, and from what I understand, you as well, we believe in the whole plant. So let's use the plant, let's emphasize the entourage effect, and let's not focus as much our research on finding synthetic replacements. Let's work on the plant, even though it may be not possible to patent it and as intellectual property.
Well, sure. No, I do believe in that approach. Until about the last 70 years, medicine was synonymous with plants, and it's still that way for many people in the third world and indigenous peoples around the world.
So the next terpenoid I actually have never heard pronounced. So I'm going to butcher it, and then you can fix it for me. Is it nerolidol?
Nerolidol, yes.
Nerolidol. Please, I have never learned anything about that.
What's probably not that common in most North American cannabis chemovars. It is a minor component of citrus. It has some interesting antifungal effects. It penetrates the skin really well and can tend to drag other things in along with it. But it's probably not one that a lot of people are going to encounter in North America, at least in cannabis.
Is the reason for that because it's not popular in the commercial cannabis world, or is it because those cultivars are from really exotic foreign countries that we just don't have the genetics here? I mean, what's the reason we don't come across it?
I'm not sure. If we knew more about the ecological role that it had, I could probably give a better answer. So you've stumped me on that one.
All right. So let's move on to caryophyllene oxide.
Right. Well, as you can tell from the name, this just has an extra oxygen on it as compared to caryophyllene. Again, very powerful antifungal. This could be the solution to nail fungus. Additionally, its real distinction is it seems to be the chemical in cannabis that sniffer dogs key in on to identify cannabis. At least that's what they thought when it was examined in Austria about 35 years ago. Nobody's really done any work on it since. So there's a research project for somebody who'd like to look into that.
Yeah, this is actually kind of a laundry list of up-and-coming research scientists about all the cool areas of cannabis that are still just like waiting for people to dive into.
Well, yeah, the article is almost 6 years old now, and I've made a bunch of suggestions, and a lot of them haven't had follow-up, so here's your chance.
So the last one in this section is Spitol.
Right. Well, phytol is pretty universal. Any dried herb is going to have some in it because it's basically a breakdown product of chlorophyll. Now, what's interesting about it is it's probably responsible for the calming effect of green tea, even though green tea has caffeine in it. Yeah, I mean that's the main thing there. So if cannabis is purely flower, not a lot of leaf, there won't be much of it, and it is a diterpenoid, the only 20 carbon molecule that's common in herbal cannabis.
So before we wrap up this section, I'd like to circle back around to your suggestion that you're not a big fan of spiking cannabis and cannabis products with terpenoids or probably any phytocannabinoid. Folks are now taking products, from edibles to tinctures, and they're starting with whole plant, which is great, but then they want to turn up some aspect of it. Say they want to make it a little more stimulating, and so they'll drop some limonene in there. Or they want to say it's more for pain, and so they'll drop some myrcene in there. So long as you start with a whole plant base, so you do have all the minor cannabinoids in there, what is the reason why you're not so much of a fan of spiking just a little bit of one or the other for its therapeutic effect?
Well, it's multiple reasons. First, we don't necessarily know the source of the terpenoids, whether they've been organically produced. Is it the right stereoisomer? If somebody goes online to a chemical supply house and looks up limonene, it isn't going to be one. There are going to be several. So it's not a simple thing for a person to pick the right one. Again, most of these aren't 100% pure. And they're not designed for internal use. Now, let's compare that to organically grown cannabis. We know what its side effects are, but it's very different using a synthesized chemical and adding that to material. But beyond that, I'd reemphasize what I said previously. This plant is capable of doing almost anything you wish, given the time and attention to selective breeding for the desired components. To me, there's no substitute for someone taking the time and effort to get the plant that they want. Sure, a lot of the things you mentioned in terms of spiking can be illuminating for people to understand the different effects, but as a practice, it's not something I'd really encourage. Finally, there's another important reason, and that is a lot of these are in commercial development of one kind or another. I know that a lot of companies are pursuing this. You cannot spike a natural plant and develop a drug out of it through the Food and Drug Administration approval process. That's considered a combination product, and so you have to do the safety, efficacy, and toxicity on the original material, the added material, and the two together, so it triples the amount of investigation that's necessary. And from a financial standpoint, it makes it an impossibility because developing a drug for FDA approval can be upwards of $1 billion at this point from start to finish.
One of the things that you mentioned about spiking is that you weren't sure if it was from an organic source. And the way I'm taking that is that you're suggesting there are synthetic terpenoids. I actually thought that all of the terps that we came across were either cannabis or food-based. Are you saying that there are such things as synthetically produced terpenoids?
The vast majority are synthetically produced.
Wow.
A lot of these are byproducts of petroleum products. The chemical company will make one thing out of another thing. And again, let's say it's 95% pure and you've got the right molecule. What about the other 5%? You don't know what that is. It will say right on the bottle that it's not designed to be used as medicine or taken internally or anything else, there's a real potential danger there. And I don't want to exaggerate. There is a potential danger there.
Right on. So we're going to take our last commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about the psychopharmacological impacts of these different cannabinoids. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest this week is Dr. Ethan Russo. If you like podcasts like Shaping Fire, chances are that you will like audiobooks too. Pretty much, audiobooks are like podcasts, except with less stuttering, better production quality, and more targeted topics. Yeah, I know. I make audiobooks sound better than a podcast, and maybe they are. But I get you. I like podcasts too. I like to learn from people talking to me while I'm doing something else, like, driving or cleaning my house or making dinner or even being at work, whatever. Here's the thing. Audible.com has an offer I want to tell you about. Right now, they are offering a trial of their audiobook service for absolutely free. You can go to shapingfire.com/audible and you will get a free audiobook, straight up. You can listen to it on your mobile device, on your computer, or you can download it and listen to it, pretty much anywhere. It's really simple. Of course, they really want you to subscribe to their service forever and enjoy more and more audiobooks. But as cannabis users, you also know how this goes. The first one is free. They're going to hate I've said that, but it's pretty great. I listened recently to Smoke Signals by Martin Lee from projectcbd.org. Martin's book is a classic of cannabis advocacy. He explains the history of cannabis in America, THC and CBD cannabis science, and why cannabis policy in America has gotten so jacked. If you consider yourself a cannabis person, this book really is a must. Talking cannabis, we all sound radical just because we're talking about weed, but if you learn the history and science of cannabis, suddenly you become smart and trustworthy to people. The book was really incredible, and there's no doubt that Martin Lee is the real deal. You can get the book for free just for doing the trial. If you don't want to listen to a cannabis book, that's cool too. There's everything else. There's sci-fi and history, biography. Hell, you can even listen to a book about card counting in blackjack. Whatever, it's all pretty rad. So here's the deal. Your first book is free. It's easy to sign up. It's easy to quit. But they do a pretty good job making me want to stay every month. Just check it out. Go to shapingfire.com/audible. to find out more. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest this week is world-renowned cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. So in the last section of your paper, Taming THC, you talk about some of the psychopharmacological impacts that these phytocannabinoids have. And so we'll touch on the same three that you talk about in your paper. So let's start with their impact on depression and anxiety.
Right. Well, there is benefit to THC and certainly to CBD in some of these mood disorders, but they can really strongly be enhanced by the addition of the right terpenoid, and particularly the pinene and limonene, respectively, for clarity from the pinene and an antidepressant effect from the limonene. There's a real synergy or boosting of effect there where you get much, much more dramatic effect in the combination than you would be with any single molecule alone.
So when they're working together like this for the entourage effect, you're finding that it kind of groups these together. Depression, anxiety. These are all your endocannabinoid system getting out of balance, and so they're working together to rebalance. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. Actually, people have this misconception. I'm afraid it's been spread around also by the medical community that depression is a serotonin deficiency. And so you need a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor to treat it. Well, they can help, but actually that isn't good science. We should think of depression as being a disorder of plasticity of the brain. In other words, you've got a loss of the ability to roll with the proverbial punches. Things aren't working efficiently. You've lost the ability to react to the environment in an optimal fashion. In fact, one of the effects of the cannabinoids seems to be increase plasticity of the brain. And again, with mood enhancement from limonene, that's a powerful combination.
So when you say plasticity, is that a part of the removal of plaque that we talk about when using phytocannabinoids to help the brain remove plaque, thus fighting things like Alzheimer's and causing neurogenesis and acting as a neuroprotectant?
Yeah, it's the neurogenesis, the regeneration of nerve cells. There are benefits of both THC and CBD potentially in dementia, like Alzheimer's disease. There is the possibility that we could help prevent plaque formation. That is one of the hallmarks of that disorder.
You know, very often when I'm talking with patients, they're asking me about insomnia. It's like, oh my gosh, I need help getting to sleep. And, it always... as part of the suggestion, I always try to find out if it's anxiety and they can't slow their brain down, or whether or not sometimes with patients it's pain, and every time they roll over it's pain, and then you have to deal with the pain first, and then you can go back and work with the insomnia. But let's say, for example, that it's not pain related and it's racing brain related, and we're trying to help people settle down and slip into good slumber. And most of the professionals that I talk to, we all kind of agree that the heavy purple indica flowers, that are packed with myrcene are a good way to go. But one thing I've never heard anybody explain is that why it works.
Well, it's multifactorial, as we like to say in medicine. Part of it is just the sleepiness, the hypnotic effect of some cannabis components, including THC and myrcene. But both of those are also painkillers. I wrote about this about 10 years ago, a review of effects of cannabis on sleep. In the clinical trials that have been done on cannabis-based medicine, the symptom that is almost always alleviated is insomnia. And again, it's a combination of factors. Number one being that there may be a hypnotic effect from the particular preparation. But beyond that, and more dramatic, is the reduction of symptoms, allowing sleep. In other words, if the person has pain, reducing the pain allows them to sleep. If they have restless legs and those are calmed, that allows them to sleep. Same thing with spasticity, increased muscle tone. Definitely the same thing with lower urinary tract symptoms. With cannabis, it's been shown that there are fewer episodes of needing to get up at night to urinate. So clearly that can lead to better sleep. So it is the reduction in symptomatology that's the most salient reason that cannabis is a sleep aid.
That makes a lot of sense. So the last one that you review in your paper is addiction, and it's become pretty common for people to use cannabis to move off narcotics, most common recently, but also alcoholism. How does that work?
Well, it's complicated, but a lot of this works through reward pathways in the brain that are mediated by a neurotransmitter called dopamine. But basically, there are different mechanisms operative. With THC, it's a little bit more mysterious, but it would pertain to modulation of the reward pathways. With cannabidiol, what has been noted is that a lot of addiction is related to craving that comes about as a withdrawal effect. And that seems to be mediated by an area in the brain called the insula. Cannabidiol has the ability to chemically turn down the activity in the insula and eliminate craving. potentially. So between the two, there can be a very generous effect on addiction issues, particularly withdrawal.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, that's a way more elegant explanation than I've been giving people. The idea that CBD will decrease the craving instead of replacing whatever the person is addicted to makes a lot of sense. So the last thing that you cover in the paper is that sometimes you have more THC than your body is prepared for, and you start to feel uncomfortable. And I think that pretty much anybody who has experimented with cannabis or has been a patient and tried to self-titrate their usage to learn how much to use. I think that most of us have had at some point an over-medicated experience, which is, has got the range somewhere between feeling a little uncomfortable and you just want to go be alone, all the way to your heart rate increases, your blood pressure drops, and you're wondering if you should call the paramedics, which is never a fun experience. And so what I'm doing is I want to set up for you, and I wish we had the wonderful slide you use in your presentations, but I would like you to tell the story that you tell about the perfect had too much THC meal.
Okay. Well, this leads us off on a historical tangent, but when I was writing the paper, I was interested in historical antidotes to cannabis. They go back, over 2,000 years. There have been allusions to citrus as being an antidote to cannabis, and it's been repeated in different cultures around the world that didn't necessarily have knowledge of one another. So limonene is certainly one, but we also have evidence for pinene from pine nuts, and so I developed what I call THC overdose meal, which would be pesto with the pine nuts and some basil, along with a drink called limonada or agua limon, which is like lemonade, but in this instance spiked with a whole bunch of extra lemon rind for that necessary limonene. But certainly if someone's had an overdose of cannabis, they're not in a position to make this meal. It'd be best to have on hand or someone else supplying it.
Have somebody there to make you a meal to help you come down. Great. So let's. I've got a couple questions that are kind of just generally related to phytocannabinoids that I'd like to wrap up with. So one of them is that, since the trichomes are the home of the oils and the terpenoids, it makes me think that potentially a product that is just the trichomes, say for example a hash or something, would be able to be considered whole plant medicine because it's all there in the trichomes. But at the same time, I doubt that interpretation because there aren't things like chlorophyll in there. So would you see a dry hash and I don't mean extracted, I don't mean like butane. I'm talking about a dry sift hash or an ice water hash. Would you consider those to be whole plant medicine?
I do. Right. The chlorophyll is an agent on its own is mainly good as a laxative. Really, in terms of cannabis flowers, the real medicinal part is the glandular trichome, and its purest manifestation would be hashish. Again, what Potter called an enriched trichome preparation. So that is going to have the full complement of the cannabinoids and terpenoids. It might not have some other elements that one would get from other parts of the plants, like canflavin, but again, those can be had on their own.
Right on. Thank you. So, there was some discussion and even some experiments in the mid-2000s that questioned the entourage effect. And in the end, it was generally agreed that the levels of CBD and other cannabinoids and the doses that they were using were too low to actually moderate the THC, kind of debunking those studies. What do you see as the required milligram dosage of CBD to successfully play a role in the patient's experience?
Well, it should be based on proportions. In the past, some dispensaries have gotten excited about very low levels of CBD, despite its being so versatile and so health promoting. CBD is not what you call really potent. There's got to be a good amount there. Generally speaking, you want, for a preparation where there's going to be CBD, you want at least as much as the THC. And in some instances, it's better to have a lot more CBD than THC.
Right on. That makes sense. So at least a 1-to-1 and up.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And so is there a threshold for that where the amount of CBD that you're intaking is too low to really have any effect at all on you?
Certainly, but it would depend also on the absolute amount of THC. Generally speaking, because it's so overwhelming in its effects, one would base the overall dose on that. So put it in these terms. 2 milligrams of THC is a threshold dose or a good place to start for someone who's not accustomed to cannabis. 5 milligrams is going to affect most people. 10 milligrams is a pretty large dose and certainly maybe too much for someone who's cannabis naive. But it would be that amount of THC with whatever amount of CBD is available, and it could be as much as 30 times as much as THC with some of the modern chemovars. But say to treat a condition like rheumatoid arthritis or schizophrenia or epilepsy, you need a much, much higher dose of cannabidiol.
So what would that number be? Where would you, much? Are you talking about 10 milligrams of CBD a day, or are you talking about 50?
No, it could be a few hundred milligrams of CBD. And that becomes difficult to obtain and can be quite expensive. But a lot of these problems are byproducts of prohibition and hopefully would be circumvented at some point in the future.
So let's say 100 milligrams of CBD in a day is what's going to be called for. Is that something that you'd be able to take all at once, or would that just totally overwhelm your intake, and you actually would need to break that down into 3 doses over the day? Well, how much can your body take?
Well, it can take in the recent clinical trials of Epidiolex, which is almost pure CBD, for seizure disorders, they've used as much as 2,500 milligrams of CBD a day, but that's without any THC. To answer your question, generally speaking, most types of cannabis and CBD should be dosed 2 or 3 times a day if we're talking about orally. And so it's not just a matter of the total overall daily dose, but how it is apportioned out. But 2,500 milligrams is a lot. At that high dose, there can be some drug-drug interactions, but at lower doses, those are quite rare with CBD. As a practical measure, though, people are not using pure CBD, and almost invariably there's going to be some amount of THC that becomes the rate-limiting factor in what people can manage to take without having issues.
So that brings us to the hot question, right? Because we're talking about how the market is working and being able to afford CBD, because CBD from medical cannabis remains expensive because of prohibition. So I want to set up this question where I'm asking your thoughts on CBD derived from hemp. Because, as whole plant people, we understand that without the constituents of the medical cannabis plants, the minor cannabinoids, to create the entourage effect, using CBD in isolate really does not get to claim the benefits of all this CBD research. You know, when you read these papers, they're invariably CBD as the primary component in the presence of THC and minor cannabinoids. And yet the CBD from hemp market is claiming that they're claiming the advantages of these studies for their CBD in isolate plant from hemp. So what are your thoughts about CBD derived from hemp?
Well, I have to be very critical. That's not a good source. And we're not just talking about hemp. We're talking about hemp refuse. In other words, the hemp has been processed for another reason, and they've done a chemical extraction to concentrate the CBD, but at the same time, they're concentrating pesticides or any other contaminants. They're really not using dedicated flower to produce the medicine, and that's the richest source and the purest source. Additionally, because of prohibition, there is not the quality control in the industry that would tell you whether this is a good product or not. So I have to be quite critical.
Okay, so I'm going to take that another step and press a little bit more. So I agree how that position suggests, okay, we should not be buying CBD isolate from China because, hemp is a wonderful toxin and heavy metals aggregator, and you don't know what's going to be what you're going to be buying. But there's some companies in Colorado now that are growing environment controlled hemp for extraction for medical products. And they're claiming that the ground is clean and such. So if we set aside the contamination factor for a moment, do you think that it is reasonable at all to, and I know this kind of goes back to the spiking idea, but let's say that you're taking some amount of medical cannabis. So you're getting kind of like this bed of THC, phytocannabinoids, including all the minor ones, but you also, because let's say you're a rheumatoid arthritis patient, you need a whole lot of CBD as part of that mix. Do you think there's any efficacy to have that base from a whole plant medicine, but then spike it with, say, 100 milligrams of CBD from hemp?
Again, that's really suboptimal to me. Proper medicine would stand on its own merits, not need spiking from anything else. And the capability is there. The proper chemovars are there. They're not available everywhere at this time. But again, I would hope for a better future on which there are good quality controlled products available that are backed by solid analyses so that consumer and physician alike can know what people are getting.
Yeah, from a business point of view, it sounds like CBD from hemp is a short-term product from a transitionary market from prohibition. I mean, the reason why it makes sense for so many businesses to try to sell it is because, whole plant medicine is still so expensive because it's being controlled. So Ethan, is it true that you're working on a follow-up to this paper?
Yes, absolutely, as we speak.
So when can we look forward to that?
I'm not sure. It's going to be in a hybrid situation, advances in pharmacology. So it comes out initially as a book, but it'll also be available as an article. It'll be pretty extensive. Covers some of the same ground as Taming THC with the cannabinoids, the terpenoids, the cannabis flavonoids, but we'll have a generous number of terpenoids that were not treated in the prior paper. And the benefit of an additional 5 or 6 years of research on some of the agents that we did discuss previously. So I'm excited about it. I'm doing that in collaboration with Jehan Marcoux, and I think it'll be a nice entry. I'm hoping it'll be available later in 2017.
Well, hopefully you'll accept my invitation when your paper comes out to discuss it here on Shaping Fire again.
I'd be delighted.
Well, Ethan, this has certainly been a lot of valuable information to absorb. I know the cannabis specialists and nerds out there like me have loved this opportunity to hear you expand on your groundbreaking paper. Thank you so much for dedicating some of your valuable time to be on the show.
My pleasure.
You can read Dr. Russo's paper, Taming THC, online for free, and you can find the link on the podcast page for this episode. You can reach Dr. Russo at his email address, ethanrusso@comcast.net. But I also want to say you've got to remember that Dr. Russo is constantly traveling the world and speaking at conventions and working. And so, sometimes he's not going to be able to get back with you right away. So he's always happy to hear from folks, but please be patient in the time frame it takes him to turn around the emails. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news and product reviews. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. For information on me and where I'll be speaking, you can check out shangolos.com. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.